The lake had a way of swallowing the noise of the world. Each ripple seemed to carry away the static hum of traffic, the sharp clang of city life, the relentless grind. When I sat on the dock, coffee steaming in my hands, I could hear fish breaking the surface and loons calling across the water. The pines framed my view like a cathedral, their resin-scented air better than any incense. Here, the idea of conflict felt almost impossible till it wasn't. I'd bought this cabin 5 years earlier, during one of the worst HOA battles I'd ever faced. At the time, I thought the solution was simple. Find a place untouched by their petty rules. No bylaws about mailbox colors, no threats over grass height, no mandated holiday decoration schedules. This was my retreat, my invisible fortress, a place where their clipboard crusades couldn't reach me. Or so I had convinced myself. Back in the neighborhood, the HOA had become a caricature of itself. What began as a committee to preserve property values had evolved into a regime obsessed with control. Some members enforced the rules politely, others treated them like scripture handed down from the heavens. And then there was Karen, their unchallenged enforcer, even after she'd left the board. She didn't need a title to wield her influence. Karen was the kind of person who introduced herself not with her name, but with her status. "Hi, I'm on the HOA board" had been her opening line for years, even when she wasn't. She wore her authority like a badge, and any perceived slight against the HOA was a personal insult to her. If she decided you were a problem, she didn't stop until she'd buried you in violation letters. And for reasons I still can't explain, I became her favorite target. The first skirmish came over a row of potted plants by my front porch. Apparently, they weren't approved decorative vegetation under the HOA's seasonal guidelines. It seemed absurd, but I laughed it off, moved the plants, and forgot about it. Then came the notice about my garden hose, which had been visible from the street. From there, the infractions grew more creative and more personal. By the third year, I was receiving monthly violation letters. Some were for trivial issues, others for rules that didn't exist in the HOA handbook. When I questioned them, Kieran doubled down, citing imaginary bylaws and threatening fines. Most neighbors gave in, afraid of escalating the situation, but I wasn't built that way. I documented every incident, every letter, every absurd demand. Eventually, my folder of evidence became too thick to ignore. I took it to a lawyer friend, who laughed in disbelief before turning serious. "This isn't just harassment, it's abuse of authority," he said, flipping through the stack. We started drafting a formal complaint, knowing it would rattle more than a few cages. Neither of us expected it to catch the attention of the state attorney general's office. When the AG's office reached out, I thought it was a prank at first. But the voice on the other end was calm, precise, and entirely real. They'd heard about my case through a network of legal advocates and wanted to meet. The goal was simple: assess whether the HOA's conduct violated state statutes. We scheduled the meeting for a Thursday at the cabin far from HOA eyes. The morning of the meeting, the lake was wrapped in fog. It clung to the water like a veil, muting the sunlight into a soft silver glow. I brewed coffee, laid out files on the dining table, and double-checked my notes. The AG's assistant had confirmed the time twice, which told me this was no casual visit. A quiet hum of anticipation ran through me like static. I wanted everything to be in order before they arrived. It's not just the paperwork, but the atmosphere of the place. The cabin was spotless, its wood floors shining, windows framing the mist outside. Even the dock looked picture perfect, though no one would likely step onto it today. It felt like preparing for a storm you couldn't see, but could sense in your bones. The Attorney General arrived right on time. Stepping out of a black SUV that looked as polished as a showroom model, they carried no entourage, just a slim leather briefcase and an air of quiet authority. We shook hands at the cabin door, their grip firm but not showy, their eyes sharp and assessing. Inside, they immediately began scanning the room, noting the files spread across my table. It was clear they were here for business, not small talk. We sat by the picture window, the fog outside shifting like restless ghosts. The AG opened the conversation with direct, pointed questions about my evidence. I answered carefully, handing over neatly labeled folders as we spoke. They took notes in a precise, looping script, pausing only to ask for clarification. Every exchange felt deliberate, like pieces being placed on a chessboard. Half an hour into the meeting, we were deep into the details. The AG was studying one of Karen's most absurd violation letters, brow furrowed in disbelief. "That's creative," they muttered, almost to themselves. We discussed potential state-level statutes the HOA might have breached.
The air
Felt charged, as though we were building toward something inevitable, and then without a knock, the front door slammed open. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot in the still morning. Karen stood in the doorway, rain-slick hair, clinging to her forehead, clipboard in hand. Her voice hit the air before her feet even crossed the threshold. "You are in violation of HOA Code Section 14B, she barked. For a moment, time froze. The AG's pen hovered above the page mid-word. My own mouth went dry as Karen stormed fully inside, without invitation. She didn't even glance at the stranger seated across from me. Her focus was locked entirely on me, eyes blazing with self-righteous fury. "I've had enough of your disregard for community standards," she snapped. Her words tumbled out like bullets, each accusation faster than the last. "This property is subject to inspection, and you've been ignoring repeated notices." Behind her, the open door let in a swirl of cold, damp air. I could almost hear the lake holding its breath. The AG slowly set their pen down, folding their hands. "Excuse me," they said, voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. Karen turned toward them for the first time, eyes narrowing in confusion. "Who are you?" she demanded, her tone dripping with disdain. The AG's reply landed like a gavel strike, State Attorney General. Color drained from Karen's face so quickly it was almost visible. Her clipboard wavered in her grip, suddenly less like a weapon and more like a shield. The AG stood, their gaze level and unflinching. "This is a private meeting concerning allegations against your HOA, they said evenly. "I suggest you sit down," Karen sputtered, trying to gather words that no longer came so easily. I was just, she began, but her voice trailed off under the AG's stare. The authority in the room had shifted entirely, and she knew it. Gone was the swagger, replaced by a nervous tremor in her hands. I leaned back, savoring the role reversal. The AG opened their briefcase and pulled out a formal document. "This is a notice of preliminary investigation into the Homeowners Association." They handed it directly to Karen, who accepted it like it was a live grenade. Her eyes darted over the printed lines, panic blooming with every sentence. This can't be," she whispered. "Oh, it can," the AG replied, their tone leaving no room for argument. They asked her to confirm her role in recent enforcement activities. Karen hesitated, glancing toward me as if I might offer rescue. I stayed silent, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of the moment. "This conversation is now part of the official record," the AG added. Karen's eyes flitted around the room like a trapped animal searching for an exit. The clipboard lowered slowly, her posture shrinking inch by inch. I'm not currently on the board," she admitted reluctantly, "but I still help enforce the rules for the good of the community." The AG's eyebrow arched with surgical precision. "For the good of the community?" They repeated, each word deliberate. They flipped to a page in my evidence folder and held it up. "This violation letter accuses the homeowner of leaving trash bins visible at 8:02 a.m. Karen's lips parted as if to explain, but nothing came out. The silence pressed in until it was almost physical. The AG's tone remained calm, but the edge was unmistakable. "Is it standard practice to issue fines without photographic proof?" Karen swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. I thought it was understood," she muttered. "That's not how due process works," the AG replied flatly. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the cabin's windows. The sound seemed to underline the weight of the moment. Karen clutched her clipboard tighter, her knuckles whitening. I could see the calculation in her eyes fight her retreat. The AG didn't give her the chance to choose, effective immediately. They said, "You are to cease all enforcement actions." Karen blinked rapidly, as though she'd misheard. "This investigation will determine whether your conduct constitutes harassment." Her lips twitched, a fragile smile forming and collapsing in an instant. "You can't just," she began, but the AG cut her off, I can, they said, their voice as steady as a stone wall. And if the findings support the allegations, you may be personally liable. That word personally seemed to pierce deeper than anything else. Karen took a small step back, her heel squeaking against the wood floor. Rainwater dripped from her coat onto the rug, darkening the fibers. The AG turned to me with a calm nod, signaling control had returned. Would you like to add anything to the record at this time? I smiled faintly, meeting Karen's wide, blinking eyes. Yes, I said. I'd like to formally request she leave my property. The AG inclined their head in agreement. Karen hesitated, her pride waging one last desperate battle. Her gaze darted to the open door, then back to the AG. Finally, she exhaled in a sharp burst, as if surrendering air itself. Without another word, she stepped backward out into the rain. The door closed with a muted thud behind her, the silence that followed was thick enough to cut. For a moment, all I could hear was the ticking of the wall clock. The AG resumed their seat, their demeanor unchanged. Well, they said lightly, that was illuminating. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The AG began gathering the papers on the table with deliberate precision. Their movements were calm, but their eyes still carried a quiet intensity. I'll need copies of all correspondence. And any future interactions, they said. I slid a fresh stack of folders toward them, already organized by date. Every scrap of evidence was now part of something far bigger than me. We spoke for another half hour, but the rhythm had shifted. The conversation was no longer about if the HOA had crossed a line. It was about how deep the misconduct ran and who else might be involved. The AG's questions probed further than I'd expected, touching on finances. Karen's intrusion had clearly opened a wider door than she realized. At one point, the AG paused and looked toward the window. The rain had eased into a mist, and sunlight pressed faintly through the clouds. People like her, they said softly, often leave a trail they can't erase. It wasn't said as a threat, but as a certainty. I felt an unfamiliar flicker of hope in my chest. When the meeting finally ended, we stood in the open doorway. The AG shook my hand firmly, the weight of the day in their grip. I'll be in touch within a week, they promised. The SUV crunched down the gravel drive and disappeared into the trees. The cabin felt strangely larger without their presence. I moved to the window, scanning the road out of habit. Sure enough, Karen's white sedan was parked just beyond the bend. Her silhouette sat rigid behind the wheel, unmoving like a statue. Carved from spite, I knew she was deciding whether to try again or retreat for good. A long minute passed before her engine sputtered to life. The sound faded, leaving only the sigh of wind through the pines. The lake lay still, its surface reflecting the breaking sky. For a moment, it was as if the storm, both weather and human, had never happened. But I knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. I made a pot of coffee, needing something to anchor me to the moment. Each pour into the mug felt like drawing a line, a small act of defiance. Some battles are won in public, but the war continues, in shadows. I had no doubt she'd be back in some form sometime. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. Before bed, I locked every door and checked each window latch. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Karen's persistence had already crossed into obsession once before. The difference now was that she'd been publicly humbled. That humiliation could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Lying in bed, I listened to the night sounds of the lake. The gentle lap of water against the dock, the low hoot of an owl in the distance. Even here, in my supposed sanctuary, the air felt charged. Somewhere beyond the trees, the queen bee was plotting her next move. I was ready for her this time. The next morning, the lake looked deceptively calm. Sunlight broke across the water in fractured shards, dazzling but fragile. I stood on the dock with my coffee, trying to convince myself it was a fresh start. The storm from the day before felt like a story someone had told me in a dream. But the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. Back inside, I checked my phone for messages. 2 missed calls from unknown numbers blinked on the screen. A single voicemail waited, Its time stomp barely past dawn. When I pressed play, Karen's voice filled the room, tight, cold, and controlled. "This isn't over," she said, and hung up without another word. I saved the voicemail immediately, labeling it for the AG's file. Evidence now came to me without even lifting a finger. It was equal parts satisfying and unsettling. The fact she called so early told me she'd been stewing all night. That kind of energy doesn't vanish. It sharpens. By mid-morning, the weather had shifted again. A breeze swept in from the north, bringing the scent of wet leaves. I sat at the dining table, spreading my files into careful stacks. The AG's. Words from yesterday replayed in my mind. Trail they can't erase. Karen's trail was looking more like a map. Around noon, I heard the distant hum of an engine. It grew louder, then faded, as if circling the area. I stepped to the window, scanning. The tree line, flash of white too bright for a deer, vanished into the curve of the road. Her sedan, or at least one just like it, was lurking nearby. I decided not to engage, at least not yet. Instead, I wrote a brief update for the AG's office, attaching the voicemail. The act felt like loading ammunition for a slow, deliberate battle. I had learned that precision, not speed, often wins these wars. Karen was fast. I would be thorough. The afternoon passed in a kind of tense stillness. Even the lake seemed to hold its movements, mirroring the pale sky. I used the quiet to prepare my next step's financial records, HOA, newsletters, meeting minutes. The deeper I dug, the more patterns emerged in their enforcement history. It wasn't just me they'd been targeting. By early evening, the sky shifted to a bruised lavender. I lit a fire in the hearth, the crackle filling the silence between thoughts. Somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped a sound too sharp to be wind. I waited, listening, but nothing followed. Still, the hair on my arm stayed upright. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the part of me that knew Karen's persistence didn't buy it. I double-checked the locks again, feeling slightly ridiculous. Still, the cabin had never felt so vulnerable as it did in that moment. Wooden walls can't stop determination. I tried distracting myself with a book, but the words wouldn't stick. Every creak of the cabin became a potential footstep. Eventually, I gave up and brewed another pot of coffee. The ritual of it helped measure, pour, wait, sip. It was the one thing I could control tonight. As darkness deepened, I heard a ping. From my laptop, an email from the Attorney General's office had arrived. The subject line read, "Preliminary findings, HOA case." I opened it, pulse quickening as I scanned the contents. The investigation had officially moved forward. The message was concise, but powerful. They had found probable cause to continue examining the HOA's actions. Witness interviews were next, starting with current and former board members. I pictured Karen's face when she received her summons. It was the first smile I'd had all day. Still, the email carried weight beyond its victory. AG asked me to prepare for possible retaliation or intimidation attempts. Apparently, my case wasn't the first to provoke this kind of backlash. That warning was both validating and unsettling. It meant Karen's behavior was part of a pattern. By midnight, the cabin was cloaked in complete silence. I left a single lamp on in the living room, its glow spilling across the floor. The fire had burned low, embers winking like tired eyes. Somewhere far off, a loon called once and then went quiet. I decided to try sleeping in short bursts. Sometime before dawn, a sound pulled me from half-dream. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, a soft crunch of gravel outside. I sat up, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. Whoever it was had no reason to be here. I moved quietly to the window, careful not to cast a shadow. The gravel drive lay pale under the thin moonlight. At first I saw nothing, just the still outlines of trees. Then a figure stepped into view at the far edge of the property. They froze when the cabin light caught their face. It was Karen. No clipboard this time, no pretense of authority. She stood with her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets. Even from this distance, I could feel the heat of her glare. She wasn't here for paperwork. We stared at each other through the glass, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. She took one slow step forward, then another. Each movement was deliberate, almost testing my reaction. I stayed still, though. My heartbeat was a drum in my ears. The night seemed to lean in, listening. Then she stopped halfway up the drive. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear the words. It didn't matter, the message was in her eyes. She was promising something, and it wasn't surrender. A moment later, she turned and melted back into the trees. I stood there long after she was gone, silence pressing hard against the windows. The moon slipped behind a cloud, erasing her trail in darkness. The lake was invisible now, its surface hidden under shadow. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. If anything, the real battle had just begun. By sunrise, the memory of Karen's midnight visit was sharp and unshakable. The image of her half-shadowed face lingered like a bad taste. I knew she wouldn't risk an outright confrontation again so soon. But I also knew she was capable of finding other ways to get under my skin. People like her rarely rest. They plot. I made a fresh pot of coffee and called the Attorney General's office. The investigator assigned to my case answered on the second ring. When I explained what had happened, their voice tightened. "That's classic intimidation," they said without hesitation. They told me to document it in as much detail as possible. I described the encounter exactly as I remembered it. The way she stood, the pockets, the unbroken stare, how she'd taken those slow, deliberate steps toward the cabin. The investigator asked if she'd said anything audible. I told them no, but her silence had said enough. They promised to add it to the case file immediately. Then came the part I hadn't expected, an offer of protective measures. The AG's office had contacts. In local law enforcement, if I wanted, they could arrange increased patrols near my property. I accepted without a second thought. An hour later, a sheriff's deputy stopped by the cabin. He was polite but direct, notebook in hand. We walked the property together, noting vantage points and entryways. He suggested adding motion sensor, lights, and a camera system. I promised to have them installed before the week was over. Even with that reassurance, the day felt heavy. I kept catching myself glancing toward the tree line. Each rustle of leaves seemed more pointed than the last. The lake, usually my comfort, felt like an exposed stage. Karen had found a way to make my refuge feel like a trap. By early afternoon, I got another email from the AAG's office. They'd officially subpoenaed HOA records from the past 5 years. That meant finances, meeting minutes, and enforcement logs. It also meant the board members would know the state was watching. Some of them might welcome the scrutiny. Others wouldn't. I imagined Karen's phone lighting up with calls from her allies. She wouldn't tell them about her midnight visit to Risky. Instead, she'd cast herself as a victim of my harassment. I'd seen her play that role before, and she was good at it. The danger was that some people still believed her. By late afternoon, the clouds rolled in again. I was stacking firewood. On the porch, when a car slowed on the road, it wasn't Karen's sedan, but the sight still tightened my chest. The driver didn't stop, just crawled past like they were looking for something. The license plate was partially obscured by mud. Stood there on the porch until the car disappeared around the bend. The wind had picked up, rattling the pine branches overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and then went quiet. I told myself it was just a curious passerby, but my gut didn't buy that explanation for a second. Back inside, I wrote down the details while they were fresh. The make, the color, the mud-covered plate, everything I could recall. I added it to the growing log of suspicious activity. The binder was starting to look less like evidence and more like a war diary. Every page felt heavier than the last. The rest of the evening passed in a tense sort of quiet. I tried to focus on organizing the HOA letters for the AG, but every creak of the cabin drew my eyes to the windows. It was exhausting to be this alert for so long. Still letting my guard down wasn't an option. The next morning brought a surprising envelope. Wedged under my door? No postage, no return address, just my name scrawled in thick black ink. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words. Drop the case. The letters were cut from a magazine, ransom note style. I stared at it for a long time before reaching for my phone. The investigator answered on the first ring this time. Describe the note, every detail from the handwriting to the paper stock. They told me not to touch it any further. A deputy would be dispatched to collect it for fingerprint testing. It was now officially evidence of harassment. Within an hour, the same deputy from before was back at my door. He slipped the note into a plastic evidence bag with gloved hands. "You're not imagining it," he said quietly. Those 2 words carried more weight than I expected. After he left, I sat in the quiet for a long time. It wasn't fear that filled the space. It was clarity. Anne wasn't trying to scare me into hiding. She was trying to push me into making a mistake. That realization hardened something inside me. I spent the afternoon installing motion sensor lights around the property. Each one blinked to life as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The cabin now felt like it had its own set of watchful eyes. I paired them with a camera system I'd ordered overnight. If she came back, I'd have her on record. That night, the first light triggered just after 11 p.m. I checked the monitor and saw nothing but shifting tree shadows. Still, my heart didn't slow for a long time afterward. It wasn't the false alarms that worried MIT was the real one I knew was coming, and deep down I was certain it would be soon. The next day, the AG's office called with an update. They'd received partial HOA records enough to see irregularities in enforcement. Certain board members appeared to have been exempt from fines entirely. Meanwhile, a small group of homeowners, including me, had been targeted repeatedly. Pattern was as clear as the lake on a windless day. "This is exactly what we needed," the investigator told me. But their tone carried a note of warning I didn't miss. "Expect pushback. People don't take kindly to exposure." I thought of Karen and her allies in the HOA. Pushback was practically their love language. That afternoon, I went into town. For supplies, the hardware store clerk recognized me from the local paper. "You're the one fighting the HOA, right?" he asked with a grin. I nodded, unsure whether his tone meant support or curiosity. Either way, word was spreading faster than I expected. When I returned, a small box sat on my porch. It wasn't something I'd ordered. Inside was a single dead fish wrapped in brown paper. The smell hit me before the sight fully registered. It was an unmistakable message, crude but effective. I called the deputy again, and he arrived within the hour. This time his face was harder, less casual. "This is intimidation, plain and simple," he said. He took the box as evidence, photographing the scene before leaving. The weight of the situation was now undeniable. That night, the motion lights flared twice in quick succession. I grabbed the monitor, expecting to see an empty yard again. Instead, I caught a blurry figure at the edge of the property. They stood there for several seconds before stepping back into darkness. I knew without proof who it was. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay in bed, every sound amplified, every shadow suspect. The cabin's cozy isolation now felt like exposure. Even the crackle of the fire seemed too loud. I realized I was counting down to something inevitable. By morning, the AG had sent another email, this time marked urgent. They'd uncovered evidence suggesting misuse of HOA funds. The paper trail linked to events Karen had personally overseen. This wasn't just about harassment anymore. It was edging into criminal territory. I printed the email and slipped it into my binder. The binder had become my shield, my sword, and my truth. I carried it from room to room without even thinking. It was the one thing Karen couldn't erase or twist. I had a feeling it was the reason she wouldn't stop. The day felt heavier than most, the air thick with coming rain. I double-checked the camera feeds before stepping onto the porch. The lake was still, its surface mirroring the bruised clouds above. Somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped sharp and deliberate. I froze, listening for the follow-up sound. When it came, it was closer. The crunch of boots on damp earth, unhurried but steady. I scanned the tree line, but saw only shifting shadows. Then a figure stepped forward, just enough to be seen. It wasn't Karen, it was a man I didn't recognize. He stood there, hands empty, face unreadable. Something about his posture told me he wasn't lost. I called out, asking if he needed help finding someone. He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, and he turned and walked back into the trees. I called the deputy, relaying every detail I could recall. He promised to send a unit by within the hour. By the time they arrived, the woods were silent again. We walked the perimeter, finding only partial boot prints in the mud. They led halfway to the road before vanishing. The deputy's eyes told me what he didn't say aloud. Whoever it was, they knew how to move without leaving much trace. He reminded me to keep the cameras running at all times. I didn't need the reminder, I was already doing that. But even cameras can't stop someone determined. That night, I set the binder on the kitchen table. I opened it to the most incriminating pages. Something told me the pressure was about to break open. The cabin felt smaller somehow, as if it were bracing too. The air was tight with the weight of what was coming. Near midnight, the motion light flared again, this time twice in rapid bursts. I grabbed the monitor and saw movement at the front steps. The figure leaned down, just out of clear view of the lens. Then a hand came up, pressing something against the glass. When they stepped back, my blood ran cold. It was Karen. Her face was pale in the infrared glow, eyes locked on the camera. She held up a folded sheet of paper and mouthed something I couldn't hear. Then she dropped it onto the porch and walked away without looking back. The paper fluttered once in the wind before lying still. I didn't open the door right away, just stared at it through the glass. The folded page seemed to pulse with the weight of its contents. Finally, I stepped outside, the boards creaking under my feet. I bent down, picked it up, and unfolded it with careful hands. The words inside made my skin prickle. "You're out of time." The note sat on my table like an unexploded device. I hadn't moved it since last night, unwilling to touch it again. Every time my eyes landed on the words, my pulse picked up. It wasn't just a threat, it was a countdown. I just didn't know to what. I called the investigator at the AG's office first thing in the morning. Their tone shifted the moment. I read the message aloud. "Don't go anywhere alone today," they said without hesitation. They promised to send someone by to collect the note. I could hear quiet typing on the other end of the line. While I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cameras were all functioning, but the feeds showed only stillness. It was the kind of quiet that hums in your bones. I closed the blinds, one window at a time. Some part of me knew it wouldn't make me feel safer. When the deputy arrived, he handled the paper with gloves. "You've got to understand this. Isn't idle talk anymore," he said. "They're trying to force you to back down before the AG closes in." He slid the paper into a marked evidence bag. "This is a cornered animal lashing out." That metaphor stuck with me after he left. Cornered animals can be unpredictable and dangerous. I imagined Karen pacing in her own home scheming. She'd crossed a line with the note, but she knew it. And people like her rarely make a move without a plan. By late afternoon, the AG's office called with major news. They were filing for an emergency court order to freeze HOA funds. The financial records showed enough irregularities to justify it. If approved, it would halt all HOA activities until the investigation was over. That kind of blow would send shockwaves through the board. I could almost picture the emergency meeting being called. Karen red-faced, trying to rally the others. Her voice sharp enough to cut through the chaos. Her eyes darting toward the phone, maybe wondering if I was listening. If only she knew how close she was to being exposed. As dusk settled, I tried to distract myself with small tasks. Stacking firewood, checking the locks, making tea. But every few minutes I'd glance at the monitors. Part of me wanted to catch her on camera again. Another part dreaded what I might see. Night fell faster than I expected, swallowing the lake. In shadow, the wind rose, making the pines whisper like conspirators. I kept the inside lights low, not wanting to silhouette myself. The cabin felt like a stage, and I didn't want to be the main act. Still, the air was too thick with expectation to relax. Just after 9, the phone rang. It was the investigator again. "The court order's been signed," they said without preamble. The HOA's accounts were now frozen, pending review. It was the kind of win that made enemies furious. And Karen was nothing if not a sore loser. I asked if this meant I'd be safer now. There was a pause on the line before they answered. "Not necessarily." This could make them desperate. The words landed like stones in my stomach. I knew. They were right. Around 10, a thump sounded against the side of the cabin. Not the sharp knock of a branch. Something heavier, deliberate. I checked the cameras, flipping through each angle. One feed showed a shadow moving just beyond the porch light. The figure was gone before I could zoom in. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, heart racing. The night air was cold enough to sting my lungs. I scanned the tree line, beam cutting through the mist. Somewhere off to the left, a twig snapped. I didn't move toward it. Instead, I called the deputy again, voice low. They promised to send someone, but told me to stay put. I returned inside, locking the door with slow precision. The monitor stayed fixed on the porch in the path. Nothing moved for the next half hour. When the deputy arrived, we circled the cabin. Near the porch steps lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a brick with a note taped to it. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. It read, "Final warning." The deputy took it without unfolding the cloth further. "This is escalating. Faster than I like," he muttered. He offered to have a patrol car watch the road tonight. I accepted without hesitation. We both knew the patrol couldn't cover every angle. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the binder. It felt heavier now, as if it contained more than paper. It held the reason for all of this, the truth Karen feared, and maybe that was why I couldn't stop myself from opening it. The next step was clear, even if it was dangerous. I flipped through the binder until I reached the newest evidence. Bank transfers, vendor invoices, and handwritten notes all lined up. The story they told was unmistakable. Money had been siphoned, and the paper trail ended squarely in Karen's lap. Seeing it laid out made my pulse quicken. I thought about making extra copies, just in case. The idea of losing this binder now was unbearable. So I scanned every page, uploading them to a secure drive. Each beep of the scanner felt like a step toward safety. But safety felt like a fragile illusion tonight. At midnight, the patrol car's headlights swept across my windows. I watched it pause at the end of the driveway before moving on. That brief reassurance faded as darkness reclaimed the yard. The lake beyond was nothing but an ink-black void. Even the usual frogs and crickets had gone silent. I was pouring a second cup of coffee when the sound came. It was faint at first, a slow, rhythmic tap on the glass. I froze, cup in hand, listening. The tapping came again, sharper this time. It was coming from the back door. I crept toward it, careful not to cross the lit spaces. The curtain hung still, hiding whatever was outside. When I finally drew it back, my stomach lurched. Someone had taped a photograph to the glass. It was a picture of me taken from the woods. My hands went cold as I peeled it free. The angle was distant, but my face was clear. I was stacking firewood in the photo, taken days ago. The realization that I'd been watched all this time sank in, and the camera they used wasn't mine. I called the deputy again, voice shaking. Despite my effort, they promised to come right away, urging me to stay locked in. Out. But even as I spoke, I heard movement outside. It wasn't running, it was deliberate pacing. Whoever it was wanted me to hear them. I reached for the binder, tucking it under my arm. If they got in tonight, it wouldn't be left behind. The front porch creaked under weight that wasn't mine. Then came a knock, 3 slow, heavy raps. Not frantic, not polite, something in between. The knock echoed through the cabin, vibrating in my chest. I didn't answer, didn't even breathe for a moment. Another 3 raps followed, slower this time. Whoever stood outside was in no hurry to leave. The air felt tight, pressing against the walls. I moved to the nearest camera feed and pulled it up. The porch was empty. My skin prickled. Someone was here, but out of sight. I switched angles, scanning for movement. The shadows under the eaves were deep enough to hide anything. Then a voice came, low and mocking. "You think you're winning?" It wasn't Karen's voice. It was a man's, rough and deliberate. He spoke as if he knew I was right on the other side, You don't know how far this goes. I gripped my phone, ready to dial again, but the voice added, "You have something that doesn't belong to you." The binder felt heavier under my arm at that moment. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed that opening it was a mistake. The pacing started again, circling the porch boards. Then footsteps moved toward the side of the cabin. I darted to the window facing that direction. Through a sliver in the curtain, I caught a glimpse. Tall figure disappearing toward the woods. Relief didn't come, only a heavier dread. They'd been testing the edges, probing for weakness. And they knew exactly what they were looking for. The binder wasn't just evidence, it was a target. And tonight proved they'd risk anything to get it. Moments later, headlights cut across the driveway. The deputy's car rolled in, scattering shadows. I met him at the door, binder still in my grip. He swept the porch with a flashlight jaw. "Said someone was here," I told him, voice low. He nodded toward the woods. Boot prints, fresh. But they were already blurring under the damp night air. He took the photo and the note from earlier into evidence. "I'll have them run for prints, but don't expect much." Whoever this was knew how to leave little behind. I locked every window and door after he left. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful, lit, was loaded. Somewhere in the darkness, I could feel eyes on me. The binder sat on the table, still within reach. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, the clouds hung low, heavy with rain. The lake was choppy, wind driving ripples toward the shore. I made coffee but barely touched it. Sleep deprivation had me wired but unfocused. Still, the binder never left the table. The AG's office called just after 9. The court order had already rattled the HOA board. 2 members were cooperating, handing over documents. That meant Karen's grip was slipping. It also meant she'd be looking for someone to punish. The investigator's voice was sharp with urgency. "You need to keep that binder safe today. No exceptions." They offered to send a courier, but I hesitated. Moving it now felt like inviting disaster. For the moment, the cabin felt like the least risky place. Rain started around midday, tapping steadily on the roof. I sat by the window watching the path to the drive. Every so often, I'd catch movement at the tree line. Each time I checked the monitor, the space was empty. The feeling of being watched never faded. By 3, the phone rang again this time. No caller ID. I almost didn't answer, but something made me lift the receiver. A pause, then a slow inhale on the other end. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice said. The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the receiver, pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't just harassment, it was calculated pressure. Every step was meant to unnerve me, force a mistake. But they underestimated how stubborn I could be. Fear wasn't going to make me hand over the truth. By early evening, the rain had turned to a steady downpour. The cameras caught streaks of water blurring the view. Still, I could make out headlights stopping at the far end of the drive. They lingered there, unmoving, for several minutes. Then, the lights blinked out, swallowed by the storm. I didn't see them again that night. But when I checked the porch in the morning, there it was. A fresh note taped neatly to the doorframe. The words were short, written in block letters. "Tonight."